Many spiritual and philosophical traditions across the world share the concept of a life force that animates all living beings. While the names and specific interpretations of this life force vary, there are some common threads and relationships between these concepts. Think of the concept of multiple heavens. Found in both the Bible and the Quran, it can be seen as representing different levels or dimensions of spiritual reality. These levels may be associated with different aspects of the life force or stages of spiritual development. But almost every culture has developed a cosmology of different generative forces, and these are often linked to their creation myth. But we only go into some of these concepts very briefly, and the focus of this video is on shaping a model that fits into the 21st century. Welcome back. First, let us dive into some of the older concepts of how different traditions have interpreted life forces. In Judaism, the Kabbalistist tradition had their interpretation, known as the Sephirot. In the Sephirot are 10 emanations of God that represent different attributes or aspects of the divine. They can be seen as channels through which the life force flows from the divine realm to the physical world. 6 of these attributes have a dual character, so if you count them as 3 pairs you get again the number 7 in total. One of the most influential figures in the later introduction of various concepts of life forces was Plato, or rather Plotinus, who introduced what later became known as Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism not only influenced many Sufi philosophers, but from the 3rd century onwards, many Christian scholars also became familiar with the concept of a multi-layered universe. Of course, Neoplatonism has many other aspects, but these are not important for this video. This graphic shows a layman's Neoplatonic interpretation of the lower levels, which are matter, animal, and plant force, and on the top, human life. The German texts ascribe different characteristics to the levels, such as is for the material, lives for the plant, and so on. If you look at the small images on the right side, you can identify the related human characteristics to each of the life forces. For instance, a woman looking into a mirror on the animal level, or a man with a frugal meal for the vegetal level, which is quite accurate in my point of view. Before we move on to my own interpretation, which can be identified as Pansufism, I need to introduce another aspect of the life forces that has been influenced by Neoplatonic, Islamic, and Sufi cosmology, in particular by the great philosopher Sufi Ibn al-Arabi. It describes creation and spiritual return as a cyclical process, called the arcs of descent and ascent. The arc of descent describes the process of creation, moving from divine unity to multiplicity. God creates, in succession, the higher intellect, the universal soul, animals and plant world, and finally, earth or matter. This is the descent from pure being to the material world. This arc of ascent describes the spiritual journey back to God. It's the process of perfection and return to the divine presence, moving from the material world back towards unity. You should now have a rough idea of how some of the layers or life forces are defined. In this graphic, you can see them all together, from the highest to the lowest. But I must mention at this point that our ordinary human mind cannot have a real understanding of these spheres. Our mind is connected to the lowest level, the material level. So everything above it, we can somehow grasp intellectually, but not in its real dimensions. When we talk about the animal or plant spheres, the animals and plants here on Earth are only the physical expression or effect of these forces. The forces themselves are rather a kind of code that enables the growth of plants or the formation of new animal species. And the basic physical counterpart to this code on Earth is the genetic code. The higher forces are marked in purple, then below the ordinary human sphere. Not much can be said about the higher spheres, because they are too far removed from our understanding. The green and blue forces refer to the so-called lower forces, known as nafs in Sufi terminology. The lower forces, including the ordinary human sphere, are connected to the earth and our heart and mind. The material force is closely connected to our mind, or rather to the attraction of the mind to material objects or images. It is seen as the greatest threat to one's spiritual development. The vegetal force is connected to our nervous system, our feelings and emotions. People who are dominated by it often lack a certain strength to deal with the world. On the positive side, it can promote generosity and empathy. The animal force is linked to our sexual drive. When it dominates, it reinforces the will to dominate others and leads to unrestrained and quick-tempered behavior. On the positive side, it can make people successful personalities and produces natural leaders. We need to talk more about the material life force. This force is the basic layer of the universe. Without it, nothing would exist in this world. Let us remember the words from Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So if we move away from the naturalistic view of this very old creation myth, then earth could be translated as matter, or even as a material life force. It says in the second verse, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." And since life force and light are both forms of energy, the material life force is the first layer that he created. And just as light is a composition of different radiations, it is the same with life forces. But the material life force is much more complex than light. It contains all the necessary information to create all the atoms and molecules needed to create life at some point in the future. It is the basis of maths and physics, even music to a certain extent. Remember the saying that the first chord of a piece of music contains, in a way, what the whole piece is about. And don't forget that the musical scale also consists of 7 notes. I mentioned that material life force is seen as the greatest threat to one's spiritual development. But why is it such a threat? First of all, when we talk about the influences of these forces on human behavior, we have to remember that the life forces do not exist in a pure form within us. It is always a certain mixture of the life forces that make up the basic quality of the energy that influences us. And even the word influence is not quite correct, because these forces are like a kind of fuel for our inner being. Furthermore, we are usually completely unaware of how this fuel works in every cell of our being and mind. We are so accustomed to it that we only begin to see a difference in what drives us when something sets apart the lower life forces and opens a space for the higher ones. Another aspect of the life forces is that they themselves have different levels or qualities, as it is shown in this graphic in the case of the material life force. We don't know much about the different layers that constitute a life force, but imagine it as a color gradient. There's blue, but we also have dark blue, light blue, and so forth. A higher level of the spectrum of the material life force is more capable and refined than the lower levels. Thus, it can be said that the lower forces have their own kind of heaven too. If someone can access those heavens through certain practices, they become a magician, capable of achieving things that exceed what is typically possible in our physical world. However, these practices are very dangerous because the powers you acquire actually end up controlling you. And any progress towards development, your true self, is blocked. Ultimately, we shouldn't concern too much with what lies beyond a basic understanding of the lower life forces. If you consider that each of the 4 lower life forces has its own 7 layers of distinct qualities, The number of combinations that can influence us is almost infinite. But why are we so challenged by the material life force? It is because our mind is so deeply connected to this force. It is both our strength and our weakest point. Our mind is one of the key things that differentiates us from animals. The mind allows us to experience time and space, to innovate, to plan for the future, and much more. It makes us almost godlike beings, allowing us to create things that were unimaginable a few generations ago. So the danger of the material life force is that by influencing and dominating us, it gains a position on Earth that is in no way appropriate for the lowest level of the universe. For all its beauty and complexity, this life force has no understanding of anything that is based on life, such as animals or plants. So when the material life force is in control, it can push us humans to destroy nature and even ourselves without mercy for any form of creation. It is not the life force's fault. It is part of its nature. It is our fault for allowing it to dominate us. That's why the word for the material world is sometimes translated as the satanic world. Or with the mythological figure of Lucifer, there is another link to the relationship between hell and the material life force. He is seen as the light bearer and a fallen angel, and became the model for the devil. But let us go on with some of the lighter life forces, which are the ones that would play an important role in the transformation process of a human soul. The ordinary human force can be defined as the sphere of common sense. It enables us to act wisely and is the first force that truly cares about the well-being of others. But it is not yet our safe haven. People who have access to this level often find it difficult to find a place in this world because, being the life force in the middle, it is a vulnerable place. All the lower forces, including the ordinary human force, cannot exist after our death without being connected to a true human sphere, inside a human being. These 7 layers define the main structure of the matrix or tree of life. And in a separate video, I will explain how they can interact with the physical or organic world and us humans, based on the theory of Jean-Emile Charron. In addition to the 7 forces that make up the universe, there are 2 auxiliary forces involved. One is the Holy Spirit, and the other is the power or sphere of angels. As far as the Holy Spirit is concerned, I have described it as the guiding force in this network, which monitors the activities and directs them in the desired direction. In my video about the Holy Spirit, I have defined this spirit as Q-mesh, and how it is related to the 3 higher life forces, and especially to the true human sphere. I see the Q-mesh as a kind of entity in its own right, with its own intelligence and inbuilt helper entities. This network is designed to guide us through the difficult process of ascension to where we have come from. Since in our current state, we are not able to discern what kind of helper entities we can eventually connect with, it is more accurate to just say that we eventually feel the presence of the Q-mesh. Quite a few people consciously or unconsciously think that humanity should step back from materialism and live more in harmony with nature. Indeed, it is our duty to bring the material, plant, and animal world back into balance. But we cannot switch from one lower life force to another to achieve this. What we call nature is in a certain balance, but at the level of the energies that drive nature, it is a constant struggle. Each of the lower life forces strives for dominance, and it is not possible for us humans to find freedom in these realms. The only way to keep things in balance for us is to look for help beyond the lower life forces. And if we find help and start our journey towards our true human nature, as this path will lead through the lower forces, it is dangerous to feel it is enough that we have left the material life force behind and not to go further. So for us, who are deeply anchored in the material world, it is indeed a quantum leap to change direction towards our true self. For only energies and guidance that are not connected to the lower forces can help us. You may ask yourself whether such a cosmology makes any practical sense at all for those who want to follow a spiritual path. The answer is yes and no. Such knowledge or information does not bring you any closer to the spiritual world from which you can get help. On the other hand, if you begin to experience the presence of the Q-mesh, then it can help orientate you to what is happening to your body, mind, and emotions. Since the process through all these layers is lengthy and doesn't follow the well-trodden paths, so a kind of spiritual compass is very helpful. But keep in mind that this journey is not for the fickle, nor for those who confuse a spiritual path with a wellness oasis. And the progress may be small, as it begins with cleansing aspects related to the physical body and eventually moves on to the emotions and passions. But let the words of the great Sufi poet Rumi describe this journey to you. I died as mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. I died as animal and I was human. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Yet once more I shall die human, to soar with angels blessed above. And when I sacrifice my angel soul, shall become what no mind ever conceived. As a human I will die once more. Reborn, I will with the angels soar. And when I let my angel body go, I shall be more than mortal mind can know.